Those things aren't what?
Clarence Thomas and Sonia Sotomayor are not comparable. I mean, Elena Kagan even
not so
sent
sure
back
about
bagels.
That. Wait, let me tell you something.
Okay.
You want to make a criticism about Thomas? I should make a criticism about Sotomayor.
And then I can add that they're not comparable.
You can't decide that they're not comparable.
Really?
During a panel discussing President Biden's proposed reforms to the United States Supreme Court, MAGA Fox News host Jeanine Pirro tried to create a false equivalence between the relative corruption of the conservative justices compared to the liberal justices, which prompted liberal Fox News commentator Jessica Tarlov to hit her with a pretty quick fact check, which in turn triggered Pirro. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, I've got a clip to show you here of this Fox News panel. But before I do, I want to remind you what exactly President Biden proposed in terms of his reforms. So there were three major ones. The first one is a constitutional amendment. No immunity for crimes a president committed in office. The no one is above the law amendment will make clear no president is above the law or immune from prosecutions for crimes committed while in office. This is a reference to Trump v. United States, a recent Supreme Court decision, which, as far as I'm concerned, is one of, if not the most disastrous in the history of the Supreme Court, effectively making the president a monarch, which is disgusting. Second proposal, term limits for Supreme Court justices. The president would appoint a justice every 2 years to spend 18 years in active service on the Supreme Court. And number three, a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. Justices would be required to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activity, and recuse themselves from cases in which they or their spouses have financial or other conflicts of interest. As far as I'm concerned, eminently reasonable, and by the way, would apply to everybody, every justice, liberal or conservative, now and in the future, makes sense. But of course, the Fox Propaganda Network is really upset about this because, of course, there's a current 6-3 conservative supermajority on the court, which more reliably delivers outcomes they want. So they want you to leave it alone. Obviously, if the shoe were on the other foot and it were a liberal 6-3 supermajority and these sorts of shenanigans were occurring, they would be like, hell yeah, we got to reform the court. But because this court gives them the outcomes they want you to leave it alone. So we're going to play this clip from The Five and see Jessica Tarlov fact check Jeanine Pirro in real time, and Jeanine Pirro whines and throws a tantrum.
Well, I just think he just made the Supreme Court even more political if it's indeed possible. And he brings up Project 25 and Roe v. Wade. And then he doesn't bring up the fact that John Roberts, as Supreme Court Justice, saved Obamacare. And I just think he had opportunity to balance it out. But it's a campaign speech that he was probably going to make, only the part where Kamala Harris was this great leader of the future probably wasn't in the original copy that he was going to say last week because he dropped out on Sunday. It's a little disappointing, but now the Supreme Court's going to be dragged through it. And I think that every time these Supreme Court justices, instead of walking around with pride, they're going to walk around feeling like they're a target.
And I just want to say something about it, too. I mean, he started this. He talked about fundamental fairness and you know, that they're going to undermine the civil rights protections. Well, Biden worked with 5 Southern senators and Robert Byrd when he came to the Senate to block integrating public schools via busing. Those 6 senators had filibustered the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and he called Byrd his mentor. So, you know, I mean, this guy just says one thing.
He gave his eulogy.
Yeah, he gave his eulogy. And then the other thing, they keep talking about making sure that these Supreme Court justices have an ethics guideline. Sotomayor's staff was always prodding people and colleagues and libraries to buy her books. I mean, don't make it about just one side. But anyway.
Well, those things aren't.
Those things aren't what?
Clarence Thomas and Sonia Sotomayor are not comparable. I mean, Elena Kagan even sent back bagels.
Wait, let me tell you something.
Okay.
You want to make a criticism about Thomas? I should make a criticism about Sotomayor.
And then I can add that they're not comparable.
You can't decide that they're not comparable.
Really?
They're both. Wait a minute. You're going to impose on people, you got to buy my boss's book and going out to whenever she lectures?
Flitting off on private jets to remote islands, having.
Okay, this isn't worth it.
Because it's not going your way anymore.
You said your point and I said mine. Now let's turn to this. If you thought the Democrats
So again, trigger Jeanine Pirro. How dare you recognize meaningful distinctions between these two justices? How dare you recognize that one is a mountain compared to a pea in comparison? How dare you do that? If you criticize a conservative justice, I'm going to criticize a liberal justice, even if the relative criticisms are, again, orders of magnitude apart. Pretty pathetic from Jeanine Pirro. Again, these people are so sensitive, hypersensitive. And again, imagine the shoes on the other foot. Imagine, and we're going to play a clip reminding you of the relative scale of the corruption of the likes of Clarence Thomas and even Samuel Alito compared to the other justices. But imagine the shoes on the other foot. Imagine it's a liberal justice. Imagine it's Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's received hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, in undisclosed gifts. And let's say Clarence Thomas instead, was pressuring staffers to, promote a book that he wrote, which, by the way, if that's true, they shouldn't be doing. But let's just flip the entire dynamic. And imagine Jeanine Pirro was complaining about the hypothetical Ketanji Brown Jackson receiving millions of dollars in undisclosed gifts. And then Jessica Tarlov piped up with, well, hey, wait a minute. Justice Thomas pressured staffers to buy a book. How would Jeanine Pirro respond? She'd be like, Jessica, what the hell are you talking about? Yeah, that sucks, but that's infinitely less important than this person receiving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in undisclosed gifts, right? Because their critical thinking faculties turn on every now and then when it favors a conservative, which is, by the way, just very rare since conservative politicians tend to be much worse than liberal politicians, but they are capable of it. We know how they would react if the shoe was on the other foot, which means that they have no credibility here. I want to also play this clip from Chris Hayes talking about bombshell reporting back from early June, which we covered on this channel, which again highlights the asymmetry, the staggering asymmetry between the likes of Clarence Thomas and the likes of Justice Jackson, Justice Kagan, and Justice Sotomayor.
New data out today from Fix the Court takes a look at the value of gifts to justices over the past 20 years, both disclosed and then undisclosed gifts that were subsequently reported out. To take you through just a handful that give you a sense, Justice Elena Kagan's calculated to have received gifts valued at just under $1,200. That's over 20 years. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, over $59,000. Again, over 20 years, $3,000 a year. Now, Justice Samuel Alito taking quite a bit more, $170,000 over 20 years. But none of that is in the zip code of the ballpark of Justice Clarence Thomas, whose gifts totaled over $4 million. To give you a sense of how that looks in chart form, take a look. Can you see where Justice Thomas is on that bar chart? The big red bar on the left? That's Clarence Thomas compared to all the other justices who served during this time. New data.
Again, staggering asymmetry. So Jessica is right to point out that any attempt to create a false equivalence between the justices here to try to help Thomas's image is ridiculous. It's bad faith. It's dishonest and should be fact-checked and relentlessly mocked, by the way. Unfortunately, in life, we encounter situations where a problem is relatively one-sided. I know we like to believe in, nuance and things being morally gray, but sometimes there are black and white issues in this world. The Nazis are bad, unambiguously. The Allies are relatively good. The Confederacy was bad. The Union was relatively good, et cetera and so forth. The Galactic Empire in Star Wars, they were the bad guys. The rebels were the good guys. Not to say that the good guys are perfect by any stretch, but sometimes there are these asymmetrical sociopolitical situations, both in fiction and in reality. It's what we have here when it comes to corruption on the court. The corruption on the court is squarely one-sided, in large part, almost exclusively thanks to Clarence Thomas, Alito to a small extent, but it's a right-wing problem on the court. But what's interesting is, you have Brian Kilmeade at the beginning of that clip whining about these reforms. Oh, he's politicized the court. I want to make it very clear. And as I've talked about, because as you know, this is a very important subject for me. The Supreme Court of the United States, no matter what its composition, 9 liberal justices, 9 conservative justices, 5 and 4, one way or the other, it doesn't matter. None of these people, none of them, not Clarence Thomas, not Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Jackson, none of them should be trusted with this level of unaccountability. It is fundamentally anti-American. It's fundamentally unpatriotic to give that level of discretion and trust and blind faith to a leader, to a government leader, to a politician. It's disgusting. I would not support just letting even the liberal justices, even though I think we can clearly we can better depend that they will behave ethically, that they will comply with ethics requirements, that they will comply with recusal standards. Clearly, that's the case. They are more dependable, but it shouldn't be discretionary in any context. We impose a $50 gift limit on members of Congress who serve for 2 years and then are subject to re-election. Justices sit for life under our current paradigm. They're appointed, they sit for life. They don't have to be elected in the first place. They're not subject to re-election, recall elections. Impeachment is the only way, or retirement or death, the only way that they leave office. And impeachment requires, as you know, a majority in one chamber, the House, and a 2/3 supermajority in the Senate. Impeachment is asymptotically impossible, particularly in today's political climate, particularly when the current makeup of the court reliably gives the Republicans the major victories that they crave. There's no incentive for the Republicans, well, bad faith Republicans anyway, to try to check this court. Again, if the shoe was on the other foot, if it were 6-3 liberal majority and the 6-3 liberal majority were engaging in corrupt practices, as the current 6-3 conservative supermajority is engaging in here, at least with respect to Thomas, and that majority, that liberal majority, hypothetically was also giving the Democrats reliable outcomes, then it would be Republicans leading the charge. But the difference is Democrats would actually be on board. As you know, others have pointed out in the past, Democratic politicians have proposed bipartisan ethics requirements for years. This is nothing new. Democrats, again, are just much more consistent on this. We don't trust anybody with that level of unaccountability and discretion. It's gross. It's disgusting. I'm sorry. It's just fundamentally un-American. And by the way, the polls show it. Majority of Americans do not trust the Supreme Court to make the right decisions in the future, 52%. This is the first time since November 2023, the Navigator's tracking, that Americans express more distrust than trust in the court to make the right decisions. The approval rating, by the way, is about 40%, okay, which is historically low for the Supreme Court of the United States. Another fact, despite the Supreme Court's ruling on presidential immunity, Americans overwhelmingly agreed that no president is above the law, 78%. This includes 58% of Republicans, 87% of independents, 94% of Democrats. By the way, super pathetic that that number is so damn low for Republicans. Again, imagine it's the shoe on the other foot. It's Barack Obama. It's President Obama in a tan suit eating a hot dog with Dijon mustard. And he was begging for absolute criminal immunity. That number would be 100% of Republicans. But because it's their cult leader, we can only squeak by with 58%. Super pathetic. By a 9-point margin, more Americans believe that the Supreme Court is, quote, making decisions that protect Donald Trump, 44%, than believe the Supreme Court is making decisions that ensure Donald Trump is treated fairly under the law, 44 to 35%. Navigator's also gone on to talk about, again, has among the lowest favorability ratings since Navigator began tracking. A majority of Americans don't trust the court to make the right decision. The views of the Supreme Court are among their lowest in history. Nearly half of Americans once again hold unfavorable views of the Supreme Court, a plurality, meaning the biggest number of the group have unfavorable views compared to favorable. And that's, again, staggering. Trust in the Supreme Court remains divided by partisanship. Again, a majority don't trust the court, but those who do are more inclined to agree with their decisions. The Supreme Court needs to be reformed. It does. And the fact that an institutionalist like President Biden is finally on board with that, to me, just reaffirms the validity of the argument. No institution is perfect. No institution should be beyond review or reform. Not Congress, not the presidency, not the Supreme Court. That's the whole point. The Constitution itself was designed to be amended. It's ludicrously high. It's by far the most difficult constitution in the world to amend. Stupidly burdensome to try to amend. But even the framers recognize, for all their faults, like, yeah, this is a draft, and it is not perfect. It is not divine, and it needs to be changed in the future. So the idea that this Supreme Court should just be left static is really stupid, gross, and un-American, especially for the reasons that these Fox propagandists provide. At the end of the day, they're just happy that they are more often than not likely to get the outcomes they want. And that means they are perfectly happy to literally cut these conservatives a blank check to do whatever the hell they want, as long as they continue to rule in the Republicans' favor. Let me know what you think in the comments.